Today we are going to discuss the second part of generativism, and that is Chomsky's criticism on behaviorism. Chomsky argued it was impossible for people to acquire a language by simple repetition and reinforcement. That means that according to the nativism and the nativist theories, it is the innateness which is responsible for language acquisition, especially first language acquisition. Chomsky, being the advocate of innateness, argues that it is not possible for children to simply repeat so much of language without having those language available or the data available in his or her mind. Children do not learn a language this way, for they do not, in fact, repeat what adults say, but produce their own sentences and create phrases which they have never heard before. He emphasized that children simply do not repeat. In fact, they create new sentences which can only be possible with the innateness and having the language rules inbuilt in a child's mind. Let's first of all see the differences and the similarities, the behaviorism and the innateness or nativism has. Now, the similarities which are there in both theories is that both Chomsky and Skinner in their approaches have, although different views and theories on the same study, which is now how all humans manage to obtain grammar, but the subject of their study is children. So the common factor in this both theories and in their studies is that their subject is children. Chomsky's theories say innate biological ability that all humans possesses. He believed that every child has a language acquisition device which is known as LAD. He also believes that innate learning mechanism enables a child to figure out how the language works. Skinner's theory, on the other hand, advocates learning process involving the shaping of grammar into a correct form by the reinforcement of other stimulus. So where Chomsky's theory believed in innate biological ability, Skinner's theory advocates learning process through reinforcement. Second point of difference is innate learning mechanism in Chomsky's theory enables a child to figure out how the language works. In Skinner's theory, approaches child as a blank slate that is filled up by knowledge gained through experiences. Now in Chomsky's theory, it is the internal mechanism, the cognitive mechanism that enables a child to figure out the language. But Skinner's theory believes that a child is born with a blank slate and his or her experiences are the ones which are responsible for the learning behavior. Chomsky wrote a review of B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior as its critique. Now, Chomsky did a review of Skinner's verbal behavior and published it in 1959. He considered it as a critique of B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior, and criticism is on the very assumption of behaviorism. Skinner applied his theory on language, and Chomsky used language as a critique tool. So basically the criticism was on the assumption of behaviorist approach to language learning, where the Skinner actually used language as a key component of verbal behavior. Chomsky used language as a tool to refute Skinner's approach of behaviorism. Now let's discuss the key features of Chomsky's criticism of behavior. Skinner's behaviorism says language is learned through stimulus response and reinforcement. That child simply repeats it in the basis of performing an action, getting a reaction, and based on reaction, repeating or repetition. Now, Chomsky's criticism is that child's language production is developmental. It is not through stimulus response. It is through the process of innateness or mental ability that a child learns grammar fairly quickly without explicit instruction, since the raw data is available in his or her mind. A child makes mistakes in the process because it is a developmental process. If there is no thought process and learning is simply action, reaction, repetition, then why a child makes error? Another criticism is that opposing argument to action, reaction, repetition is that no mere repetition, mental process extracts rules, applies, and then creates new sentences. So which means it's not just mere repetition. In fact, a mental process completely extracts rules from the innate ability, applies those rules, and then creates new sentences. So, action, reaction, repetition notion has been refuted by Chomsky based on these two categorical comments. Chomsky refers to his view not specifically as a criticism of Skinner's speculations regarding language, but rather as a more general behaviorist critique of speculation regarding the nature of higher mental processes. Chomsky refers it not as a personal or specific criticism towards Skinner's approach, rather it is a general criticism which encompasses the general approaches of behaviorism. Reason for discussing Skinner's book in such detail was that it was the most careful and thoroughgoing presentation of such speculations. So he pointed out that the reason he criticized verbal behavior is that this book or this approach has covered substantially the presentation of all those speculations which form behaviorism. In his words, he says, I do not, in other words, see any way in which his proposal, which means Skinner's proposals, can be substantially improved within the general framework of behaviorist or new behaviorist. New behaviorist is those who believe in stimulus response reaction as well as the rationality and cognitive aspect of learning and developing a behavior, or more generally empiricist ideas that has dominated much of modern linguistic psychology and philosophy. The conclusion that I hoped to establish in the review by discussing these speculations in their most explicit and detailed form was that the general point of view was largely mythology. It lacks substance. It is basically primarily belief and based on myths, and that its widespread acceptance is not the result of empirical support, persuasive reasoning, or the absence of plausible alternatives. So basically, what he's saying is that there is no margin of improvement in this particular approach. To conclude, Chomsky believes that Skinner's behaviorism fails to justify the assumptions that the external factors condition a child to respond in a particular way. It is the innate ability of a human that is responsible for learning and developing a language.